So I'm happy to introduce our first in-person presenter for today, Joe Dickinson, who's here from London. Please come on up.
Hello. Do shout if you can't hear me. I'm getting a lot of feedback. So I'm Joe. Today I will be speaking about the thought process of planning and executing a mount using a costume in the Victorian Albert Museum's theatre collection as a case study. I'm focusing a lot more on a single mount, unlike the previous presenters. So first I'm just going to talk a bit about the things we consider when we're planning a mount, which tend to focus, as we've already seen, on the important aspects for a visitor to see, and then contrasting that with the conservation concerns that might limit our mounting options. The object I'm discussing in this talk is a costume worn by Sir Henry Iving as the demon Mephistopheles in Faust. Henry Iving was a very famous British Victorian-era actor, manager. He was the first actor, actually, to be awarded a knighthood, which shows his importance. And this is a costume from a performance in 1885, which actually travelled to America. This performance also utilised a really early instance of special effects in theatre, where Irving, as the manager, sort of designed special effects with the lighting that would be very dim in a gaslit theatre at that time, having glasses that would make the demon's eyes gleam, and special connections in a glove and shoe, which allowed sparks to fly between swords during sword fight scene between the demon and the protagonist. And this performance was so well known that it was replicated in a advertisement for crackers. So evidently the sparks were considered important. So the parts that are included in this costume are, as you can see, the whole get-up of Sir Henry, with the cloak, jerkin, breeches, and a lot of these, what I'll say, phrase as the costume elements, were already planned to be displayed on a mannequin, which was mounted by Geisa Werner, requiring some minimal support from me. You can see that the tail there is just being held up by a bit of string, and I made a simple, swing mount, essentially, to support that, and a little bit of support to get the hood in place. But primarily, I'll be talking about the glove and the shoe, and these invisible glasses, which look like they're from the 90s, but are actually from the 1880s. So I spoke to the curators about which are the important aspects of this costume to be seen, or the accessories. So like I said, for the glasses, the really important thing is seeing how minimal they are, because it's very strange for this period. But generally, when theatrical or costume elements are displayed, part of what we try and do is convey some of the animation of that performance, because it's such an important part of the item. And we want to see what the audience would see as a visitor. So we want to see this plain side of the glove and shoe, but we also want to see the inside, how the tricks work, those metal elements of the glove and shoe, which are connected by a very old and frayed electrical cable, which would have run up through the trousers and down the sleeve. So, having chatted about what was important, I proposed a couple of different potential display methods, either in order to utilise this animation that Geisa had got from in the mannequin from the costume, displaying them off the mannequin. So the glasses on the face and the shoes and gloves they wouldn't have fitted on this mannequin, because his hands and feet are a lot larger than a Victorian gentleman's, but aligned with them so that you'd got an impression of what it would have looked like on the stage. The limitations of that would be that obviously it's a lot more difficult to see both sides of the elements if they're displayed alongside the costume, but also the glasses were so small, as much as that is the intent, it'd make it hard to see them. And they might look a little bit odd on this featureless face, which was the mannequins used in this display. So the other option I proposed was to have them separate from the mannequin. Obviously that does slightly disassociate the different elements of the costume, but it allows those special effects to be highlighted. And using a simple mirror, we could show both sides of the glove and shoe so that we could see how the special effects work, but also how invisible that would have been to the viewer. We also discussed, which I think is an important thing to talk about, even at a mount making conference, is how important not making a mount sometimes is. The glasses are such fine wire that any mount I made, in order for it to be structurally stable enough to support it, would have been overpowering and would have hidden those wire elements. So we decided just to place those on a plinth and have the glove and the shoe separate to that on a floating mount over an angled mirror so that we could, like I said, see all of those sides. In order to try and retain some of that animation of the costume, the curators requested that we try and bend the fingers on the glove to give us an impression of a sword grip. And then there's always the conservation concerns, which tend to limit what we want to do. There were some fragile elements of the shoe, which just required a bit of additional mount making support. I did acrylic inside to make sure it wasn't collapsing in on itself, and just some elements to avoid where the upper and the sole were separating. But the particular concern was the glove, which was very fragile, and that fragility limited the ability to bend the fingers. The other thing that conservation wanted was for the mount to remain inside the glove for storage after it came off display. So as you can see here, how it had been stored, it just had some support put inside, but since we were making a custom-made inner that would fully support this object, it would be good to use that in future for its safety in storage as well. So we have this conflict between the conservation concerns and the display intent. We needed a solid element inside the mount in order to float it, and the shape for fingers I've usually created using just bent acrylic rods. So straight rods, slightly bending them at the finger joints. And as you see here, where it's not possible on historic fragile gloves, the glove ends up looking very static and loses that animation we were hoping to have. So, thinking of solutions, I went back to a mannequin and the articulated limbs which they often have on them, which can sometimes be used to bend elements of the costume once you've got it safely on the mannequin, so you're not having that stress, which is the main point of concern on the glove, of getting the fingers into the glove. You can get it safely in while the elements are straight, and then bend it. Mannequin hands themselves weren't going to work in this, partially because they were either too big, in the case of a modern adult hand, or a lot too small in the case of a child's hand. And also these hands that were usually made out of wood, and if that's something that we want to be using for long-term storage inside an object, that's really not something we want to do. So I then started considering whether it was possible to make a bespoke acrylic hand articulated in order to solve all of these issues. So, in order to make this bespoke articulated mount, I first drew around the glove shape and created these bespoke hinged fingers from acrylic rods that I just cut to the size. To ensure that there were no materials other than acrylic being placed inside this, plus the pad softening that my colleague was going to make, I used thin acrylic rods fixed with acrylic weld as pins in the hinge joints, so it was all acrylic. And I just had extra little hinge joints to fix them onto the palm. I did find it slightly problematic angling the thumb correctly, as that joint's a lot more complicated than fingers. And we ended up, under discussion with conservation, deciding it wasn't really time efficient to take the time to make the thumb work, as the intended position of a sword grip has it quite straight anyway, and that could be achieved through the padding done by conservation. So once I'd made the hand, milled some fixings and passed it on to Roger Morris in textile conservation to pad it up beautifully, and then moved on to the shoe, identifying a couple of points where I could fix into it at the heel in this electrical fixing you can see, and on the toe away from the fragile elements of that split in the metal, and also a slight separation that there was between the sole and upper. I shaped a bit of brass bar to fit these elements, soldered them together, added armatures and softening, and you can see the finished elements of that there. And this is the completed mount, showing front and back, showing the inside of the glove, and also how those fingers were able to be bent. So we were able to get the fingers on completely straight and then just carefully ease them round with discussion from my colleagues in conservation to decide what was appropriate. This is the mount on display with just a piece of mirrored acrylic bent to form a simple lectern underneath, and showing how you can see both the benign side that would be seen by the audience in the theatre, but also the tricks hidden in behind these elements while on display. And I'd like to thank Simon Sladen, Gaeta Werner, Susanna Fiado, and Rasheen Morris for all of their input in this display. And thank you all. That's me and my hand done. Any questions?
Thank you for your talk, Joe. Could you elaborate more on the pins and the sort of hinging, where the phalanges hit the palm of the hand, if you will?
Yeah, so I mean, you can possibly see it easiest here. So they're just simple, simple hinge joints. So it's just, I sort of explain it slightly more in the slide, but I figure everyone kind of knows how to make a hinge joint, so it's probably not. So I just sort of, I split each bit of the end of each bit of the rod into three. At one end, I cut out the middle section. At the other end, I cut out the two outer sections. I just rounded them off, and then, like I said, in order to not have anything other than acrylic in it, I didn't want to have any metal fixings. So I popped the two parts I wanted to fix together in a vise together. I drilled through it with just a little bit of like a 2mm screw, and popped a little bit of 2mm acrylic rod through it, and used acrylic weld, so just a slight dot on the two outer bits, so that fixed the rod to those two outer parts of the hinge while leaving it the central section freely movable, so we could have a fully acrylic hand.
You just kind of answered my question, but just to reiterate, with the pins that you used within the joint, there was enough tension there that it would stay in place once you bent the fingers?
Yeah, so that was more obtained by having the joint itself quite tight fitting. So I sort of, well, after I'd marked up, I went on the outside of the markup for the internal one, and on the inside. So the central bit was quite tight fitting inside it, and then it was slightly, I sanded it so it's slightly abraded, and so the two slightly abraded pieces of acrylic fitting onto one another created the tension you needed for it to hold in place. And obviously, because it's at its side, it's not actually having to be holding weight under tension, so it didn't need any more than that in order to hold it in place.
Wow, that's really precise. Good job.
So, Joe, I have a question. So that mount was going to remain in storage for the glove itself?
Yeah, so, I mean, as you probably saw in the final ones, it did have, my colleague Rasheen made this sort of outer padding to go over it, so it had quite a lot of softening on top of it. This was just sort of the internal bit and was quite significantly smaller than the glove in order to allow there to be the room for that padding. And because it was off-gassed acrylic, it's usually considered to be okay for it to be in storage. I imagine the leather glove is probably more damaging to the metalwork that it's being stored with than the mount.
So you didn't have a concern about weight in terms of storage of the hand being either palm down or palm up? So the acrylic basically was just the skeletonized interior of
it's actually very light, the acrylic hand, but if there was a concern about that, it could just be, it's got the rod, so it could be mounted hovering for storage if they wanted to. But actually, the metal elements sort of sitting down were a lot heavier than my mount at all, so it already had the sort of weighted elements, and it's a lot better for not allowing the distortion of the glove than what had been done previously. So, I mean, we rarely have a perfect solution, but it's better than a bit of tissue.
Quite good. Quite good. Thank you.
What did you use for a barrier material between the plexi and the glove?
So, as I said, it wasn't actually me that did that. That was my that was Rasheen Morris from Textile Conservation at the V&A. It was the outer part was a Bauman's fabric, so a conservation grade black fabric, and then inside I think she just had some polyester wadding, but unfortunately, as I didn't do that aspect of it, I can't be certain. Hope that helps.
Yes, thanks.
It's a brilliant mount. I want to commend you. But this is kind of a silly question for, did anybody ever like play around with the electrical part of the special effects, like reverse engineer it? Like how exactly did that work? Was the stage electrified?
No, there was no, I mean, you can see after, what is it? It's getting on for 130 years now since it was made. I don't trust a lamp from the 80s, so, and the wires are very frayed. They've actually been disconnected from the shoe, so they're sort of like looped on to give the impression of being connected for display, but they're actually disconnected now to prevent it from being sort of too twisted and to prevent further damage to that wire. And I mean, you can see the mesh on the glove is a bit rusted, so I'm not entirely sure what would happen. I mean, it sounds like it was quite dangerous in the 1880s when it was being used with electricity running through it, because it was, live currents, and I mean, this is at a period where I think it was only like 15 years earlier that somebody developed a iridescent light bulb. So the use of electricity in a sort of normal, personal sort of sense was really early, and I don't think very well controlled or much health and safety involved. So, yeah. All good. That's kind of difficult to say because I started, and it was sort of one of the things I was working on in and out of things, which is one of the reasons I was sort of able to do a slightly more complicated mount. It probably took me, I guess, where is it? The sort of the cutting down the fingers and making the articulated fingers, I think took about a day. And then it was about a month later that I managed to get back to it in order to attach them to the palm and then make the other elements, which took a couple more days. So yeah, I guess like 3 days all in all, which of my work, but then there was obviously other work going on around it, of other people padding things up and stuff. And like I said, I never quite managed to get my thumb attached. Somewhere in the mount shop.
Hello. On your first slide, it says that you're independent. What is your education background, and do you do this full-time, mount making?
I'm currently not employed at an institution, but I was working at the V&A when I made this. And I have studied archaeology and then conservation. So I have, I guess, a bit of a hodgepodge background. I tend to think about things a bit from a conservation point of view, which I enjoy.
I just want to ask you, because this is a piece of art on itself, and I was just wondering, because it's quite elaborate and you took a lot of work to make. I'm not very experienced in mounting clothing or textiles, but if somebody asked me to do this, I understand you did it because you want to enliven the glove and that it didn't look
give it some
very
animation.
rigid. But if somebody would ask me to do it, I think I would take quite some sturdy though soft metal and around it foam, so you can bend it. And what made you decide to take this option?
So the reason for using acrylic rather than, say, like a soft aluminium bar, which is often also used in sort of like limbs of mannequins for exactly that reason, is again back to why I didn't want to use wood. It's because it has to be left inside the object. And generally speaking, we don't want to leave metal elements inside an object, particularly when it's also got metal elements itself, because sometimes if things goes... if there's any connection and things, then that can cause problems, and you don't want there to be any possibility of sort of one galvanizing the corrosion of the other or anything. I guess the other benefit of this was that you don't have to put much pressure on the glove in order to bend it. You could just put a very light sort of bend and it would bend round as much as it wanted, whereas depending on the density of the aluminium, it can sometimes be quite difficult to get it to bend, and often sometimes gives you rather odd extra elbows, which doesn't look too good on display. I hope that answers it.